So welcome to lecture 4, and in lecture 4 we'll be dealing with information classification. Now, information classification is pretty critical for security because you need to know something about the value of the information that you're protecting. How could you possibly or reasonably protect information when you have no idea of how valuable or important it is to the organization? So you've got to determine the value of the information in order to determine the cost-benefit trade-off associated with its protection. So there's always a trade-off in protecting information. And so when you're dealing typically with sensitive or confidential information, you're going to apply increased security measures to that data, as opposed to data that may be public or available on the website. That information is not going to be subject to the same security safeguard. And so there's always a cost in security, and sometimes that cost is substantial. So we wouldn't necessarily protect all the information in exactly the same way because that is going to be cost prohibitive. What we are protecting when we're protecting information is an asset. And an information asset, is a definable piece of information stored in any manner that has a recognized value. So it may be stored in paper, it may be stored digitally, it may be stored through memoranda of agreement. And so an information asset will be used by a company to fulfill its mission. So you need to know, what the objectives are of the organization. It can be used to support internal operations. So for example, payroll is an internal operation for which you will need information about the employee and their pay. And then if compromised or damaged, there are consequences that might include embarrassment, legal liability, financial ruin in some cases, and in fact even loss of life. There have been situations where spouses have shown up to work and the information has been released, and there's been domestic violence in the workplace, and all of these things relate to information that's been breached in some way. So it's a very serious, can be a very, very serious problem, and so we need to know, what the value of the information in order to know what security measures and safeguards to apply. So let's consider some examples of information assets. They can be found in databases, in files, in intellectual property, the support procedures that you are going to be developing, research documentation for certain companies or archived information, as well as business plans. All of these have recognized value for an organization, and it's important that we know, how valuable it is in order to know how we're going to apply our security safeguards to it. So in this week's lecture, we'll be discussing information classification and asset management. So imagine you were given a job at a large company. Your job is to protect the information assets of the company. And while you're waiting for your security clearance to come through, you are not permitted to know anything about the information you're supposed to be protecting. Now, if your supervisor was to ask you to see your security plan by the end of the week, would you be able to do that? If so, how? And if not, why not? What information would you need to know about what it is you're protecting? And that's really what asset classification seeks to do. It seeks to essentially figure out what is the classification, what's the priority, the sensitivity of the data that we are tasked to protect. So before you know how to protect your assets, your information assets, you've got to know something about its value. You need to know, what the trade-offs are associated with the security that you're going to apply to that data. So if it's very sensitive information, you will want to provide additional security measures there in terms of new staff or equipment, and this can be very expensive. So, how you apply your security budget will be proportionate to the sensitivity of the data that you are dealing with. Now, in some cases, you may want to provide the same measures for all information that the company has. I mean, if it's a small company, that's quite possible. But in a large company, you're going to have massive amounts of data, and therefore you're going to want to protect certain data from its access to unauthorized use over others. So in order to do this, you need to know how information assets are defined. Now, an information asset is regarded as a definable piece of information stored in any manner that has a recognized value. So information assets are used by a company to fulfill its mission or goal. It can be used to support internal operations such as payroll. But if compromised or damaged, it can result in embarrassment, loss of reputation, financial ruin. In some cases, it can even result in loss of life. If you think of employees that get murdered by their spouses, for example, because their information has been leaked. Some examples of information assets include the database, data files, intellectual property, operational and support procedures, research documentation, archived information, and business plans. Now, every information asset needs an owner. You need to keep that very firmly in mind. It's a bit of a counterintuitive concept because the owner won't necessarily be the user of that data. They may be different. But the owner is responsible ultimately for the protection and accountability of that data. That's why it is important. So knowing who the information owner is of critical importance. So the information owner is the person who is liable and responsible for protecting information and the business results derived from the information. Now, oftentimes, people who work in IT department own the organization's information. They think that it's the IT department's role or ownership there. But that's not true. And it's very, very important to understand this as an IT professional because you don't necessarily want to take on unwanted obligations in this regard. So your role as an IT professional would be as an information custodian. You take care of the information. You don't own the information as such, right? You take care of it in terms of your task. You have a dedicated responsibility to protect it, to define it, classify it, for example, but you don't own it in the same way that the information owner does. So what's very important is that you identify information ownership roles. They don't have to implement security controls, so you can delegate that. But if you have a medical file at your doctor's office, the owner of that information is going to be the doctor, right? Because the doctor is ultimately responsible. If it's a hospital, it'll be senior management. They are ultimately responsible. If there were a breach, if there was a loss of or corruption of the data, it is those people that will be held accountable. So they're the information owners for this purpose.
So with a medical file, you don't own your own medical file, and it's not necessarily the person who uses the information, so it's the nurse. In a small practice, it'll be the physician, and in a larger practice, it'll be, or at a clinic or a hospital, it'll be senior management that are ultimately responsible or information owners there. So in the context of a bank, the senior loan officer might own the information pertaining to customer loans, and then they have, with that, they have responsibility for deciding who has access to this information and the policies for using the information. We'll get to access control in a later section. But they are responsible for establishing the controls to protect the information. Now they can delegate that to the information custodian, you, or an information or an IT department within the organization. But they are the person that is delegating that task. The data owner is, the role of the data owner addresses the need to account for our information assets and assign an owner to the asset. The goal then is to ensure the appropriate protection is maintained by identifying all major assets and owners given responsibility for security. So information owners then have the responsibility to assign values to the asset, to its classification. They determine who should access the asset. They define the level of protection necessary. They delegate day-to-day tasks for the maintenance of security. They provide oversight and enforcement, and they are permitted to delegate classification responsibilities. They can say, okay, well, this is the data that we have. This is, this can be regarded or classified as sensitive data, and go ahead and classify the data, or come up with a classification procedure that we can approve. So asset classification will assign the following responsibilities. It'll have an information owner, they define the protection, an information custodian who implements that directive, that protection, and then the information user. So they're the person that is using the information asset in accordance with the classification label. So we'll get to that in a second, but essentially that's the frontline worker, the person actually using it on a day-to-day basis. So the information security officer is not the owner, but they provide direction and guidance as to the appropriate controls, and they ensure that those controls are applied consistently within the organization. So there are classification criteria. They can be involved in maintaining the information system inventory, implementing strategic and tactical security initiatives. Those are all roles of a information security officer. Now, information classification is the organization of assets according to their sensitivity to disclosure. It will reflect, who should have access to the information. And the classification labels that we assign identify the sensitivity label. You should know, what type of data you're dealing with based on its classification, the level of sensitivity there. Now, different kinds of information will have different levels of importance. So, common practice within the private sector is to say that there is data that is information assets that are protected legally. They may be confidential. They may be for internal use only, or they may be public. Military classification that's used quite commonly is top secret, secret, confidential, and unclassified. if the information is protected, there's going to be a legal requirement to protect that piece of information, right? So it's always good to know that everybody knows this, can delete this. So these are things like memorandums of agreement, any contractual obligation or managerial discretion. So think of examples of data that should be protected, right? So things like annual reports, those are going to be public, for example. Policy documentation, manuals, lists, employee lists, those are for internal use. Confidential, so business strategies, financial positions, product schemes, things that are in the works, those are all going to be confidential. Anything that's protected or privileged, maybe things like patient records, payment card information, social insurance numbers, those are all going to be protected classes of information. Data that is confidential is going to be essential to the mission of the organization. So the loss or corruption or unauthorized disclosure could result in significant financial or legal damage to the organization. Internal use data is necessary for conducting ordinary company business, and then unauthorized disclosure may result in harm to business. So things that are related to their reputation, credibility, financial or regulatory compliance. Public information is made available to the public without any implications to the company. So I've given you some examples here. You've got annual reports, policy documentations, business strategies, and protected classes of information. So understanding what data that you are protecting is really important as to how you're going to apply your security policies and procedures to them. So other classified approaches are, as I've mentioned, are from the government and military. So things like that would be regarded as let's say, top secret, defense plans, complex cryptography systems, those are all going to be top secret. If you work in the military, you're going to be dealing with this type of classification structure. Unclassified information typically will not result in any injury to the organization or people. And these can be things like speeches that have already been delivered, news releases, but we have to be careful about defining this. Just because something is public doesn't mean it should be. And so sometimes people get released or misclassify information and release it, and they didn't mean to, but now it's out in the public and it can't be retracted. So the thing you need to be asking for every piece of information is, what is the worst thing that could happen if this information got into the wrong hands? You have to think about that in terms of your classification process. So the first step of any hacker is to collect the data regarding the environment. So it may be the case that corporate web pages will have detailed information. Leadership bios can be used for phishing attacks, for example. So it's possible to reveal system vulnerabilities through things like your privacy statement or any kind of public expressions like that. So we need to think carefully about what a hacker or a bad actor would be using the information that is known publicly about the company. So there may be multiple levels of information, right? So if you have a single system that may a single system may contain every level of importance, right? So it may have top secret or confidential, as well as public or unclassified documentation. In those cases, I mean, as long as there is some data that is sensitive, all the system, the entire system, has to be treated as sensitive. So that's the way you need to think about it. So it's really important to know where the data is. And in large companies, that's not a trivial exercise, actually, because over time, people may not have filed the information correctly. There is loss of staff, for example, or changeover, and then things don't get appropriately either classified or stored. And so for this reason, you need to figure out ways in which to organize that data into the appropriate information system. So this is why you need an information classification policy. It gives you the classification system, it defines classification levels, it requires that all major information assets are classified, and then it assigns responsibility for those information assets. A policy like this will also allow for reclassification. So some questions you might want to think about. Who is the information owner of your Gmail account? And who is the information custodian of your Gmail account, right? So those are two kind of useful questions there. For your, the owner for your Gmail account would be the Gmail area manager within Google, right? And the custodian would be the IT administrator within Google. Notice neither of those things are you, right? Because you are the information user. Safeguards that need to be put in place can be technical, physical, or administrative. Safeguards must be considered when sensitive information is being created, accessed, stored, transmitted, distributed, and destroyed. So the primary safeguard for sensitive information is labeling. Labeling is critical when you're dealing with sensitive information. So once the information has been labeled, it can be classified. So labeling is the vehicle for communicating the sensitivity, right? So you want to make it very clear, very well understood. You want to know that the label should clearly indicate what the data is for and its sensitivity. So that will follow from the classification how that information is to be handled. And this way you know how what administrative procedures or technical access can be put in place then to control for the sensitive information. One way to do this is through a decision matrix. Another way is through a set of safeguards that are published. So there are a number of different ways of determining how the information is going to be handled. So here's a sample handling matrix. You will see the handling standard of, for example, data storage workstations at home. You can't store protected information there. You won't be able to store confidential information, but you can, use internal use there, for example. So this is a common matrix that you'll know how to be handling the data that you have. Let's consider some safeguards in relation to laptops. Assuming that you've got high or medium sensitive information, you want to be able to install, for example, a specific encryption technology. You want to encrypt the directories containing sensitive information. You don't want to encrypt applications or the operating system. You want to ensure access is password protected. You don't want to keep a record, of the password with the laptop. That often happens. You want to encrypt sensitive information, and that becomes important if there's a breach. And if there has to be a process in place to report to the manager or help desk if the laptop is lost. Here's another example of safeguards for removing information from an office. You would want to get authorization in writing from a program manager. You may have a simple record, date and time it was removed, date and time it was returned. You don't want to leave information unattended at any time in a boardroom, for example, or a washroom. You don't want the information in an unlocked in a hotel room, for example. Another safeguard for physical storage, you want, in the case of high sensitivity or confidential information, you want that stored in a locked fire-resistant container. If it's medium sensitivity, you want it locked in a secure location. If it's both high and medium, you want to ensure that it's authorized, accessed by authorized employees only. You want to keep your work area clear of sensitive material and control visitor access, as well as escort visitors to and from the door. In the case of electronic storage, you want highly sensitive information to be stored in an encrypted form. You want to test backup copies to ensure that the information is recoverable. You would want, in the case of medium sensitivity, you would want to store under the access control list. And then for medium and high data assets, you would want to have a lock station feature, maybe use a screensaver, and enable audit functions on the server and hard drive. In the case of disposing of physical media, you may have a procedure in place for shredding paper, documents, breaking CDs or DVDs. A big part of this is knowing the retention schedule, ensuring that only authorized employees are involved in the removal and destruction of documents. This may involve a records retention log and ensure that the log reflects the date of the information when the information was destroyed. In the case of electronic media, you are likely going to want to have a mandatory wiping of hard drives on leased or equipment to be disposed of for all sensitivity levels. If you're going to overwrite file space, you need to do that by an approved method. You would want to remove all directory entries and delete backup files. So the procedures here for information classification will include defining the asset and supporting information systems, characterizing the criticality of information system, identifying the information owner and information custodian, assigning classification level, determining and implementing corresponding level of controls. That's done by the information custodian. labeling information and information system appropriately, document handling procedures, including disposal, integrating handling procedures into information user security awareness programs. So training is going to be a big part of this, and then declassifying information if that's appropriate. A key aspect then for us to understand is the information life cycle. Information may be classified or declassified. You may downgrade the sensitivity level to public, for example. Sometimes you may want to upgrade the sensitivity level to higher classification. And so, understanding where that the information asset may go through different classifications through its term of use. So going back to our original question about how would you know what you're protecting, you need to know something about the value and the criticality of the information system. So in calculating the asset value, it's not a perfect science, you can say, but you need to think about what is the cost to acquire or develop this information? What's the cost to maintain and protect it? What's the replacement cost? How important is it to the owner? Is there any competitive advantage of that information? Is there any marketability of the information? You want to know the impact on delivery of product or services, the reputational loss, for example, through breach or loss of that data, any liability issues, as well as regulatory compliance requirements that may be in place that you need to be aware of. So for that, you are likely to have an inventory of information system assets policy. The goal there is going to be to ensure the information system assets are documented and tracked. You would want to, for example, the hardware and software is tracked. There would be a policy for system assets in this regard. System characterization articulates an understanding of the system, and that includes the system boundaries, the hardware and software, the information stored, how information is stored, processed, or transmitted. Ranking the information and system components will consider the information protection level and the system impact, that is to say, the importance of the business. Ranking this will tell the organization which assets are most important. That's going to be very, very useful information for you as you design a security protocols around these information assets. So a question that we have to think about is which is mattering more, the system impact or information protection. That's going to depend on the business. And think about the businesses that this may apply to, and what may be more important, the impact of on the system or the protection of the information itself. Thanks very much, and I'll see you in the next lecture.